The wind across the Chihuahuan desert carried no secrets, only sand and the memory of heat. It scoured the flatlands, whispering through skeletal creosote bushes and over cracked earth that had long ago forgotten the taste of rain. On the horizon, where the sky bruised purple with the coming afternoon, a stagecoach kicked up a plume of ochre dust, a slow-moving wound on an unforgiving landscape. From his perch on a rocky outcrop, Jedediah Kane watched it crawl. He sat his horse a stoic buckskin with a single unique brand on its flank, a coiled serpent eating its own tail. Jedediah was a man carved from the same hard country, his face a roadmap of sun and sorrow. His dark hair was pulled back from a brow that seemed permanently furrowed, and his eyes, deep-set and watchful, held the stillness of a man who had seen too much of the world's frantic violence. He was just passing through a ghost, on his way to nowhere, trying to outrun a name that was not his own, and a past that was. The crack of a rifle shot split the air sharp and final. It was followed by a chorus of whoops and the thunder of a dozen horses descending from a hidden arroyo. They moved with brutal efficiency, a pack of wolves on the hunt. Jedediah's hand went instinctively to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, but he kept his distance. This was not his fight. He had made a vow to himself, a promise sealed in blood and ash, that his fighting days were done. The bandits swarmed the stagecoach, forcing it to a grinding halt. A man in a tailored black duster and a wide-brimmed hat dismounted with predatory grace. Even from a distance, Jedediah could see the cruel confidence in his posture. This was Silas Knox, a name that was becoming a plague in this territory. His men, a rough collection of cutthroats, dragged the passengers out onto the dusty road. A well-dressed man, a drummer by the look of his sample cases, protested. Knox didn't argue. He simply drew his revolver and fired. The sound was flat obscene in the vast silence that followed. The man collapsed, a small puff of dust rising from his chest. Life was cheap out here. Jedediah knew that better than anyone. He was about to turn his horse and ride on to leave this ugliness to the buzzards when he saw it. Knox knelt beside a weeping woman, her husband now a cooling corpse beside her. He snatched something from her neck, a glint of silver in the punishing sun. It was a locket. Something inside Jedediah fractured. The vow he had made to himself shattered like sun-baked glass. He spurred his buckskin forward, not with a hero's charge, but with the desperate urgency of a man reclaiming a piece of his own soul. He rode into the chaos, his face a mask of cold fury. "The locket," he said, his voice a low growl that cut through the bandits' coarse laughter. Silas Knox looked up, a flicker of amusement in his cold eyes. "Well now, look what the wind blew in. A stray with a death wish." His men leveled their rifles, a dozen muzzles aimed at Jedediah's chest. He ignored them, his gaze locked on the silver locket clutched in Knox's gloved hand. "That trinket is of no value to you," Jedediah stated, his hand hovering over his Colt. "Give it to me." "Everything has value." Friend Knox sneered, dangling the locket from his fingers. "This woman's husband paid for it with his life. Why should you get it for free?" He opened the locket, glanced at the tiny portrait inside, and then snapped it shut. A pretty face. Worth dying for, I suppose. The face in that locket wasn't the passenger's wife. Jedediah knew with a certainty that turned his blood to ice that it was a portrait of his wife, Sarah. The locket was identical to the one he had given her, the one she had been wearing when she died. The one he had lost in the chaos of his former life. It was a ghost made real, a relic of the man he used to be, Thomas Greyhawk. He didn't think. He drew. His shot was a blur of motion, not aimed to kill, but to disarm. The bullet sang past Knox's ear and splintered the frame of the stagecoach door behind him. For a heartbeat, there was stunned silence. Then all hell broke loose. Jedediah was fast, but he was one man against a dozen. A bullet seared across his arm. Another tore through the leather of his saddle. He fired back, forcing them to take cover, his mind focused on a single objective. He spurred his horse forward, leaning low and snatching the locket from Knox's momentarily surprised grasp. "Kill him," Knox roared, his face contorted with rage. Jedediah wheeled his horse around bullets whining past his head. He dug his heels into the buckskin's flanks, a prayer on his lips that was more curse than plea. He fled into the labyrinth of canyons and mesas, the silver locket clutched tight in his hand, its metal cool against his fevered skin. He had failed to intervene as a hero, but in retrieving that locket, he had answered the call of a ghost. He was outnumbered and wounded, a lone rider with a fresh target on his back, but he had the locket. He had the last piece of his lost life, a memory of love, in a world that seemed to hold only violence. And as he rode, he knew he wasn't outrunning his past anymore. He was riding right back into its heart. 2 days later, Jedediah Kane rode into Redemption Gulch. The name was a bitter joke. The town wasn't being redeemed. It was being bled dry. It sat hunched under the weight of the sun, its clapboard buildings leaning like tired old men, their paint peeled away by years of sand and sorrow. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything, muffling the sounds of the few souls who still shuffled along its single sorry street. This was a town on its last breath, economically strangled by the same man Jedediah had fled from, Silas Knox. He dismounted in front of the general store, the buckskin's reins loose in his hand. The wound on his arm throbbed a dull, insistent rhythm, a reminder of his folly. He had come for supplies, and more importantly, for anonymity. But a glance around told him he was unlikely to find either. The faces that turned to watch him were hollow-eyed and suspicious, the eyes of people who had learned that strangers only ever brought trouble. From the shaded porch of the town's only church, a man in a dusty black coat watched him with the predatory stillness of a vulture. Reverend Fallon's voice was a fixture in Redemption Gulch, a rasping sermon of fire and brimstone that echoed from his pulpit every Sunday. He condemned the sin of greed while his pockets grew heavy with tithes, and as rumor had it, secret payments from Knox himself. He saw sin in every shadow but his own. The saloon doors swung open, and Sheriff Maddox stepped out, blinking in the harsh light. He was a man worn down to the nub, his shoulders slumped with the weight of a star he no longer believed in. A thick mustache failed to hide the weary droop of his mouth. He was the law in Redemption Gulch, which meant he was little more than a manager for Knox's slow-motion conquest of the valley. He saw Jedediah, noted the trail-worn clothes and the grim set of his jaw, and his eyes slid away, uninterested in a problem that wasn't yet his. Then Jedediah saw her. She was walking out of the mercantile, her head held high, though her dress was patched and faded. Her name was Ruth Holloway, and she carried her sorrow with a quiet dignity that seemed an act of defiance in this broken town. He'd heard the whispers as he watered his horse. She was a widow, shunned by the townsfolk for 2 sins they could not forgive, her late husband's gambling debts and a womb that had borne no children. She was a ghost in her own life, visible only when someone needed a target for their scorn. As if on cue, a woman fanning herself on the boardwalk. Marble Carter called out in a voice as sharp and unpleasant as splintered wood. "Well, if it isn't the barren widow. Come to beg for credit you can't pay Ruth." Marbell had once been Ruth's friend, back when the Holloway ranch was prosperous. Now her resentment was a poison she dripped into the town's well of gossip whenever she had the chance. Ruth didn't flinch. She simply clutched the small parcel in her hands, a bit of flour perhaps, and continued on her way, her spine straight, her gaze fixed on some distant point only she could see. Her resilience was a quiet marvel. a single wildflower pushing its way through cracked stone. In her, Jedediah saw a reflection of his own isolation, another soul cast out and left to weather the storm alone. He watched her go, a strange ache in his chest. He was a man haunted by the memory of a woman he couldn't save. He had retrieved her locket, but it was a cold comfort. Opening it, he stared at the tiny painted face of his Sarah. Her smile was a memory of a life that felt like it belonged to another man, a better man named Thomas Greyhawk. He snapped the locket shut, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He was no hero. He was just a man trying to find a place quiet enough to bury his ghosts. But Redemption Gulch, he was beginning to realize, was no place for ghosts to rest. It was a place where they were put on display. The spectacle began at noon, under a sun that offered no mercy. A crude wooden platform had been erected in the center of town, an auction block not for cattle or land, but for a human being. Silas Knox, dressed in his immaculate black duster, stood beside Sheriff Maddox, observing the proceedings with the satisfied air of a man admiring his own handiwork. This wasn't about money. Ruth Holloway's husband had owed Knox a paltry sum. This was about power. It was a demonstration, a cruel piece of theater designed to show the people of Redemption Gulch what happened to those who could not pay their debts to him. Ruth was led to the block, her hands bound in front of her. She did not weep or beg. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes fixed on the distant, hazy line of the mountains. Inside, a storm of memories raged. She thought of her husband James, of the sweet words he'd whispered when they were first married, and the bitter silence that had followed the loss of their second child. She thought of the small, empty cradle she had finally put away in the attic, a monument to a future that had died before it could be born. She had been judged barren by her husband and by the town, and now she was being sold like chattel, the final humiliating chapter in a life of quiet grief. The auctioneer, a portly man, sweating through his shirt, began his patter. Here we have one Ruth Holloway, a widow of good standing now. Less so. Her husband's debts fall to the town, and the town must be repaid. Reverend Fallon nodded sagely from the sidelines. The wages of sin are debt, and debt must be collected. Laughter, jagged and cruel, rippled through the crowd. What use is a barren woman? Someone shouted. Marble Carter smiled behind her fan, savoring Ruth's public disgrace. Ruth closed her eyes, her resolve hardening into a shield. They could sell her body, but they could not touch the core of her, the small, unyielding part of her that still remembered who she was. The bidding started low and went nowhere. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. This was part of the cruelty. Knox wanted her to stand there, unwanted, worthless, a living symbol of his dominion. The auctioneer was about to close the pathetic affair when a voice cut through the heat, calm and steady. 20 silver dollars. Heads turned. The crowd parted, murmuring. Jedediah Kane stepped forward, his face unreadable. He walked past Silas Knox, his eyes briefly meeting the gang leaders. In that fleeting glance, an unspoken challenge passed between them. Jedediah had recognized him instantly. This was the man from the stagecoach, the man with the cold eyes and the cheap regard for human life. Sheriff Maddox shifted uncomfortably. That's a generous sum, stranger. It's a fair price for a person's freedom, Jedediah said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. He dropped a heavy leather pouch of coins into the sheriff's hand. The sound of the silver striking the wood of the auction block was like a gavel, decisive and final. Knox's eyes narrowed, a slow, dangerous smile playing on his lips. He saw not an act of charity, but an act of defiance. This stranger had interfered with his business once on the road, and now he was doing it again, here in the town Knox considered his own. Jedediah ignored him. He walked to the platform and with a small knife cut the ropes binding Ruth's wrists. Her skin was raw beneath. She looked at him, her eyes clouded with confusion and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "You're free," he said simply. He didn't offer a kind word or a soft smile. His gesture was not born of pity or affection. It was a blow struck against a man who dealt in human misery, a debt paid to his own battered conscience. "I have a place," he said, his voice low. "North of here. It's quiet. You'd be safe." He offered her shelter not as a suitor, but as one outcast to another, a shared recognition of what it meant to be alone in a hostile world. Ruth looked from Jedediah's scarred, somber face to the sneering smile of Silas Knox, and then to the scornful faces of the townsfolk who had gathered to watch her fall. This silent, haunted stranger was offering her an escape, a path away from this humiliation. Without a word, she nodded. As she stepped down from the auction block, leaving her old life behind, she knew she was trading one uncertainty for another. But for the first time in a long time, she was walking toward it on her own 2 feet. Jedediah Kane had bought her freedom, but in doing so, he had just purchased a war. The trail to Jedediah's homestead was a rugged, unforgiving path that wound its way into the high country. They traveled in a tense silence, and the only sounds the clop of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon Jedediah had acquired in town. Ruth sat beside him on the buckboard, her hands folded in her lap, her posture rigid. She was free, but she felt like a parcel being delivered, her fate now tied to this grim, silent man who had paid $20 silver for her. Who was he? A savior, a captor? She watched him from the corner of her eye, noting the way his hands rested near his gun and the constant sweeping survey of his eyes across the landscape. He was a man accustomed to danger. Jedediah was just as wary. He was a man who had built walls around himself thick and high, and now he had brought a stranger inside them. He was haunted by the woman he had failed to protect, and having another woman depend on him felt like tempting the same cruel fate. He could feel Ruth's mistrust like a physical presence, a weight added to the guilt he already carried. As they rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, the smell hit them first, the coppery tang of blood on the dry air. Ahead, a wagon lay on its side, one wheel splintered and broken. Sacked goods were strewn across the ground, and 2 bodies, a man and a woman, lay still in the dust, their journey brutally ended. It was the work of scavengers, human or animal. It was hard to tell. Jedediah pulled their wagon to a halt, his hand on his Colt. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice tight. He dismounted and approached the scene with caution. It was a robbery, clear and simple. The dead couple were dressed like city folk, unprepared for the savagery of this land. He was about to turn away when he heard it, a thin, wavering cry, nearly lost in the wind. The sound came from a small, overturned crate a few yards from the wagon. Jedediah kicked it aside. Inside, wrapped in a linen blanket, was an infant. The baby's face was red and tear-streaked, but its eyes, a startling shade of blue, were wide and alert. Ruth, unable to stay put, had followed him. She gasped when she saw the child, her hand flying to her mouth. For a moment they just stood there, the living and the dead, and the impossibly miraculously alive. Jedediah knelt, his movements surprisingly gentle, and lifted the infant. The baby's cries subsided into small, hiccuping sobs as he was cradled against Jedediah's chest. This was a complication he could never have anticipated. His plan was to live out his days in isolation, alone with his ghosts. A child. A child was an anchor to the world, a demand for a future he didn't believe he deserved. Ruth stepped forward, her earlier mistrust momentarily forgotten, replaced by a deep, instinctual ache. Is he? He's alive. Jedediah said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. He looked at Ruth, and in her eyes, he saw not the shunned widow, but a woman staring at the very thing the world had told her she could never have. The decision was unspoken. They couldn't leave the child here to die. Without another word, Ruth gathered the linen blanket while Jedediah ensured the baby was secure. They became in that moment an unwilling and unspoken partnership. They scavenged what they could from the ruined wagon, a small satchel of clothes, a leather-bound journal that had fallen near the man's body, and a canteen of water. They said a silent prayer for the dead and left them to the earth. The rest of the journey was different. The silence was no longer one of tension, but of shared responsibility. Ruth held the infant whom they began to call Eli, rocking him gently. The baby, exhausted from his ordeal, slept against her, a small, warm weight that felt both foreign and profoundly right in her arms. Jedediah's homestead was a small, defensible cabin nestled against a rock face, a place built for solitude. When they arrived, the fragile domesticity of caring for Eli began. They learned to work together, their movements hesitant at first, then more fluid. They were two strangers, a scarred man running from his past, and a grieving woman, robbed of her future, now bound by the needs of a helpless child. This infant, a survivor of a brutal massacre, likely perpetrated by Knox's men, had forced them into a fragile found family. Their first, most pressing obstacle was simply surviving the night, learning to trust each other enough to keep a baby warm, fed, and safe, while the shadow of Silas Knox and his patrols began to stretch ever closer to their isolated sanctuary. The days that followed were a delicate dance of distance and necessity. Jedediah and Ruth moved around each other in the small cabin, their lives dictated by the rhythms of the infant Eli. The child was their silent mediator, his needs bridging the chasm of mistrust between them. At night, while Eli slept in a makeshift cradle, Jedediah would sit by the fire, cleaning his weapons, his face lost in shadow. It was during one of these quiet evenings that he opened the leather-bound journal they had recovered from the ransacked wagon. The script inside was precise, with the entries detailed. The author was a man named Elias Vance, an investigator from the Santa Fe Territorial Office. He had been tracking a land-grabbing scheme documenting how a man named Silas Knox was systematically terrorizing homesteaders, forcing them to sell their land for pennies on the dollar before murdering them to silence any protest. The journal was filled with coded notes maps of wells Knox had poisoned and references to a hidden ledger that contained the full scope of his criminal enterprise. Suddenly, their plight was no longer just about survival. Jedediah held evidence, a weapon that could bring down the man who was a threat to them all. The fight was no longer just his. It was for the justice Eli's murdered parents had sought. Recognizing the escalating danger, Jedediah knew they couldn't remain defenseless. The next morning, he retrieved a Winchester rifle from a heavy wooden chest. He found Ruth by the corral, her hands gently calming a nervous mare. "You need to learn how to use this," he said, holding out the rifle. Ruth looked at the weapon, her expression conflicted. "I'm not a killer, Mr. Kane." "Neither am I anymore," he replied, his voice quiet. "But survival isn't about what you are. It's about what you're willing to do. This isn't for killing. It's for choosing." He took her out to a clearing and set up tins on a fence post. His instruction was patient, methodical. He stood behind her, correcting her stance, showing her how to control her breathing. "Don't fight the recoil," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Become part of it. Find the stillness between one breath and the next." As she practiced, the initial fear in her eyes was replaced by a look of focused determination. She was a natural, her hands steady, her aim true. The years of quiet endurance had forged in her a formidable composure. During these lessons, The walls between them began to crumble. She told him about her father's farm, about the brothers she had lost to sickness. He in turn shared a small, guarded detail about his late wife, Sarah, how she loved the smell of rain in the desert. They were small offerings, fragments of past lives shared in the space between rifle shots, seeds of trust planted in barren ground. A week later, their fragile peace was shattered. A rider approached the homestead not with the aggression of an outlaw, but with the casual confidence of a neighbor. It was Silas Knox. Jedediah met him at the edge of the property, his body language a study in relaxed tension. Ruth watched from the cabin doorway, Eli in her arms, her heart pounding. "Just making the rounds," Knox said with a disarming smile, though his eyes were as cold as a winter river. "Making sure my new neighbors are settling in. I heard you took in the Holloway woman. A charitable act." "She needed a safe place," Jedediah said evenly. Knox's gaze swept over the homestead, lingering for a moment on the buckskin horse tied to the corral. His eyes narrowed slightly as he saw the brand on its flank, the coiled serpent. A flicker of recognition crossed his face so quick, Jedediah almost missed it. "You know," Knox said, his tone turning cryptic, "this land has a way of calling in old debts. A man can change his name, change his face, but the past, it has a long memory." He tipped his hat. "You take care now. Both of you." As Knox rode away, a cold dread settled over Jedediah. Knox hadn't just been making a threat. He had been delivering a message. He knew. Somehow he knew exactly who Jedediah Kane used to be. The final piece of the trap was sprung not by Knox, but by the petty jealousies of Redemption Gulch. Marble Carter, hearing whispers that the barren widow was now living with a man and caring for a child, felt a spike of bitter envy. The life she felt Ruth didn't deserve was now seemingly hers. Fueled by resentment, she paid a visit to Sheriff Maddox. "That man Kane," she said, her voice dripping with sanctimony. "He's hiding out with that Holloway woman, and they have a child. A baby that isn't theirs. It ain't right, Sheriff. It ain't decent." Maddox, weary and wanting only a quiet life, saw a way to appease his true master. He rode out to Knox's main encampment that evening. "The stranger you were asking about," he told Knox, "he's holed up in the old miner's cabin in Stone Creek Canyon. He has the woman with him, and a child." Knox smiled, a slow, terrible unfolding of his lips. The board was set. The pieces were in place, and the man he knew as Thomas Greyhawk had nowhere left to run. The coded entries in Elias Vance's journal had haunted Jedediah for days. Cross-referencing the investigator's cryptic notes with an old survey map of the territory, he finally deciphered the location of the hidden ledger. A collapsed mine shaft in the foothills, a place locals avoided believing it to be cursed. He knew going there was a risk, with Knox's men undoubtedly patrolling the area, but the ledger was their only real weapon. He explained the plan to Ruth. "I'm going after it," he said. "You should stay here with Eli. It's safer." Ruth, who had been methodically cleaning the Winchester, looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "You bought my debt in town, Jedediah. You made it yours. This debt, this one, belongs to both of us. I'm going with you." He saw the steel in her eyes and knew arguing was pointless. They left Eli with a supply of milk in the relative safety of the fortified cabin, the journey a silent, nerve-wracking ride under the cover of dusk. The mine shaft was a dark, gaping mouth in the side of a hill, its timbers rotted and collapsed. A sense of foreboding hung heavy in the air. Leaving Ruth to stand watch with the rifle, Jedediah lit a lantern and ventured inside, the air growing cold and stale. He followed the journal's crude map past treacherous drops and through claustrophobic tunnels until he found it a loose stone in the wall. Behind it was a small locked strongbox. He carried it out into the fading light and together they forced it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the ledger. Its pages were filled with names, dates, and figures, a meticulous record of Silas Knox's reign of terror, extortion, land theft, and murder, all detailed in cold, hard ink. It was enough to see him hang a dozen times over. But as Ruth turned to the final page, she gasped. The last entry was not about finances. It was a note scribbled hastily by the investigator. My God. The final piece. Knox is not his birth name. He is Silas Kane. Records show he had an older brother, a known outlaw who ran with the Lobo Ridge gang, named Thomas Kane, alias Thomas Greyhawk. Jedediah felt the ground beneath him give way. The world tilted, the sound of the wind in the pines fading to a dull roar in his ears. Thomas Kane. A name he had buried years ago, along with the man he had been. Silas, his younger brother. Skinny, eager to please Silas, who had followed him everywhere, who had idolized him. The memories came flooding back, a torrent of guilt and grief. The botched robbery, his gang reckless and drunk on cheap whiskey, a lantern overturned in a stable, the fire spreading with terrifying speed to the small house next door. He remembered the screams. He remembered running his gang, pulling him away, telling him it was too late. He had been told that Silas, his wife, and their young child had all perished in the flames. He had fled, changing his name, trying to outrun the ghosts of the family he had destroyed. He had believed his brother was dead. But Silas had survived, and the grief and rage of that night had twisted him, curdling his soul into this monstrous version of himself. Silas hadn't just been building a criminal empire. He had been hunting for him. This wasn't about land or money or justice anymore. It was about a fire. It was about a dead woman and child. It was a deeply personal war of revenge and atonement. And Jedediah was standing on a battlefield he hadn't even known existed. He looked at Ruth, her face pale in the twilight, and he saw the terrible truth reflected in her eyes. Silas Knox, Silas Kane, would not stop until he had taken everything from his brother, just as he believed his brother had taken everything from him. The ride back to the homestead was steeped in a heavy, suffocating silence. Jedediah felt the weight of his brother's name like a shroud. The ledger, which had promised justice, now felt like a death warrant. When they reached the cabin, the sight of Eli sleeping peacefully in his cradle was a sharp, painful reminder of what was at stake. Jedediah turned to Ruth, his face etched with a despair she had never seen before. "You have to take the boy and go," he said, his voice ragged. "Take the buckskin. Ride east and don't look back. This isn't your fight. It never was." Ruth met his gaze, her own eyes filled not with fear, but with a quiet, unshakable resolve. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her touch a small point of warmth in the cold dread that filled the room. "You took on my debt in town when you had no reason to," she said softly. "You stood for me when no one else would. This one is ours to share. We will face him together." Her words were not a declaration of love, but of alliance, a bond forged in shared hardship and sealed by a common threat. In that moment, their fragile partnership solidified into something unbreakable. He was no longer just a man paying a debt to his conscience, and she was no longer a victim he had rescued. They were a family, however, unconventional, standing on the precipice of a war. With the decision made, a grim purpose settled over them. They began to prepare for the siege they knew was coming. This was their dark night of the soul, a time to confront the ghosts of their pasts, to find the strength for the battle ahead. Jedediah worked with feverish intensity, his movements fueled by years of pent-up guilt. He barricaded the windows, leaving only small slits for firing. He dug shallow trenches around the cabin and set traps, tripwires connected to falling logs, pits concealed with branches, using every bit of outlaw knowledge he had tried so hard to forget. Every swing of the axe, every knot he tied, was an act of penance. He was fighting not just for Ruth and Eli, but for the brother he had lost long before the fire, the boy who had once looked at him with admiration instead of hatred. Ruth moved beside him, a steady and calming presence. While he prepared the defenses, she prepared for survival. She filled every available container with water, cooked what rations they had left, and tore strips of cloth for bandages. Her grief for the children she had lost was no longer a hollow ache, but a source of fierce protective strength. Eli was the child she had been given, and she would not lose him. As she loaded cartridges into the Winchester, her hands were steady. She was no longer a woman defined by what she couldn't do, but by what she must. As night fell, they sat together by the hearth, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The ledger lay on the table between them. Ruth had managed to tear out a single page detailing Knox's extortion of a neighboring rancher, a page she had slipped to a young stable hand on their trip to the mine, with instructions to deliver it to Sheriff Maddox. It was a desperate gamble, a small hope that the lawman's buried conscience might be stirred. "He believes I abandoned him." Jedediah said, his voice barely a whisper, speaking of his brother for the first time. "He thinks I left him and his family to die in that fire." "What really happened?" Ruth asked gently. "It was chaos." Jedediah recalled, his eyes seeing a past he could never escape. "The fire. It moved so fast. My men pulled me away. They told me everyone was gone. I ran, Ruth. I ran from the guilt, from the man I was. I should have gone back. I should have died with them. That man, Thomas Kane, is gone." Ruth said, her voice firm. "He died in that fire too. The man sitting here is Jedediah, and you are not going to die tonight." Her words hung in the air, a promise and a prayer. Outside, the wind began to howl, picking up speed, whipping sand and dust against the cabin walls. A storm was coming, a physical manifestation of the violence that was about to descend upon them. They had fortified their home, but more importantly, they had fortified each other, two broken souls finding the strength in one another to fight for a future they had only just begun to believe was possible. The attack came with the dusk. The sky, already bruised and hazy, darkened further as a massive sandstorm rolled in from the plains. The wind howled like a banshee, whipping grit and dust into a blinding shroud that gave Silas Knox and his gang the perfect cover. The world outside the small cabin shrank to a maelstrom of screaming wind and swirling sand, punctuated by the first crack of a rifle. "They're here," Jedediah said, his voice grim. He moved to his position at a fortified window, the Winchester feeling like an extension of his arm. Ruth was already at another, her own rifle ready, Eli's cradle tucked safely in the root cellar beneath the floorboards. The first wave of attackers came on foot, shadowy figures materializing out of the dust. Jedediah and Ruth fired in coordinated bursts, their shots economical and precise. They weren't trying to kill, they were trying to survive. A man cried out and fell. Another retreated, clutching his shoulder. The wind swallowed the sounds, the chaos heightened by the stinging sand that obscured vision and choked the air. From the edge of the maelstrom, Silas directed his men with cold fury. "Burn them out," he roared. A flaming arrow arced through the storm, embedding itself in the dried timber of the barn. Flames erupted, hungry and wild, casting a terrifying flickering light against the swirling dust. The barn, their only other major source of cover, was now a funeral pyre. Jedediah knew they were being flanked. "I have to draw them away from the cabin," he yelled to Ruth over the roar of the wind and fire. "Keep them pinned down." He burst out the back door, using the burning barn as a diversion. He moved like a ghost through the storm, his colt barking in the dark. He fought with the desperate courage of a man with nothing left to lose, but his real goal was singular: to face his brother. He found him near the inferno of the barn, and the flames lighting his face in a demonic glow. Jedediah wounded a deep gash on his leg, slowing him, limped into the circle of light. "Silas," he called out. His brother turned a triumphant, broken smile on his face. "Thomas, I knew you wouldn't die easy. I wanted to look you in the eye when I took everything from you, just like you did to me." "It was an accident," Silas Jedediah pleaded, his voice raw with decades of guilt. "I never meant for it to happen. I thought you were dead." Silas laughed, a sound more terrible than the storm. "Dead, no. I survived. But do you know what I remember from that night, brother? I remember getting out. I was clear of the flames." His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "I could have gone back for my wife, for my son. But I heard your gang riding away. And in that moment, I made a choice. I chose revenge over them. My own guilt has been the fuel for this fire all these years. It twisted me into this, Thomas. And now I'm giving you the same kind of choice." He tossed a revolver at Jedediah's feet. "Kill me. Become the monster I know you are. Avenge the woman and child you're protecting in there. Or spare me. Let the law you've never trusted handle it, and live with the knowledge that you let your family's killer walk." While the two brothers stood locked in their tragic standoff, Ruth fought her own battle. The remaining gang members, seeing Jedediah occupied, surged toward the cabin. Her transformation from a victim to a protector was absolute. She fired the Winchester not with rage, but with a cold, clear purpose. Her shots weren't meant to kill. A bullet to a kneecap sent one man down. Another shot shattered the stock of a rifle, rendering it useless. She was a bulwark, a mother defending her child, her inherent morality and strength shining through in the disciplined restraint of her violence. Just as her ammunition was running low and despair began to set in, a new sound cut through the storm, and the thunder of hooves and a voice shouting, "In the name of the law." Sheriff Maddox, his face grim and determined, charged into the fray with a hastily formed posse of townsfolk. The page from the ledger Ruth had sent him had worked. Shamed by her courage and confronted with undeniable proof of Knox's crimes, Maddox had finally found his conscience. The tide of the battle turned instantly. Knox's men, caught between the posse and the fortified cabin, threw down their arms. In the burning barn, Silas saw his empire collapsing. He lunged for his own gun, but Jedediah was faster. He didn't fire. He slammed the barrel of his Colt against his brother's head, sending him crumpling to the ground, unconscious. He had made his choice. He would not become his brother. As the last of Silas Kane's men were rounded up, the sandstorm began to recede. The wind died down to a mournful sigh, and the thick curtain of dust thinned, revealing the first pale, fragile light of a new day. The dawn sky was streaked with rose and gray, a quiet promise after a night of fire and fury. The homestead was a wreck. The barn was a smoking skeleton of charred timbers, and the cabin was scarred with bullet holes. But it was still standing. Jedediah, wounded but alive, limped out to meet Ruth. She emerged from the cabin, Eli held securely in her arms, his sleeping face peaceful and unaware of the battle that had raged around him. They stood together amidst the wreckage, the silence between them, no longer one of distance and mistrust, but of deep, shared understanding. Sheriff Maddox and the townsfolk approached, their faces smudged with soot and exhaustion. They looked at Jedediah and Ruth, not with the suspicion of old, but with a newfound respect. These two outcasts had done what the entire town had been too afraid to do. They had stood up to the darkness. Marble Carter was brought forward, her face a mask of shame. She had been found hiding, and her role as an informant was now exposed. The glares of her neighbors were her punishment, a shunning more profound than any legal sentence. Reverend Fallon stood at the back of the group, his Bible clutched in his hands, his usual booming condemnations silenced by the quiet courage he had just witnessed. His hypocrisy had been laid bare for all to see. Maddox clapped a hand on Jedediah's shoulder. "You did the right thing, Cain, both of you." Silas Cain, bound and regaining consciousness, was loaded onto a wagon, his empire of fear broken. As he was led away, his eyes met Jedediah's one last time. There was no hatred in them now, only a vast, empty expanse of loss. Later inside the battered cabin, Ruth gently tended to Jedediah's wounds, cleaning and bandaging them with practiced hands. They worked in comfortable silence, their shared ordeal having forged a bond stronger than words. The home they stood in was damaged, but for the first time, it felt truly theirs. Weeks later, the town of Redemption Gulch was slowly coming back to life. With Silas Knox's influence gone, a fragile sense of hope began to take root. People started to repair their homes and their spirits, the air no longer thick with fear, but with the dust of rebuilding. Jedediah traveled to Santa Fe, where he testified against his brother. Armed with the ledger and his own testimony, the case was airtight. In light of his actions, protecting Redemption Gulch and the circumstances of his past, the territorial court cleared him of his old crimes. The name Thomas Cain was officially buried, and Jedediah Cain was given a clean slate. He returned to the homestead where he and Ruth began to rebuild. They repaired the cabin, built a new barn, and tilled a small patch of land for a garden. They were no longer two broken people seeking refuge from the world, but a family creating a world of their own. Eli, now strong and healthy, took his first steps, holding onto Jedediah's finger, his laughter echoing in the quiet canyon. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Jedediah took out a small carved wooden box. He opened it and looked at the silver locket at the tiny smiling portrait of his first wife, Sarah. For a long time, this object had been a symbol of his failure, a ghost that chained him to his guilt. Gently he took the locket and placed it inside the box. Then he placed something new beside it, a charcoal sketch he had commissioned from a traveling artist, a portrait of Ruth holding Eli. Her face serene and strong, the child looking out at the world with bright, curious eyes. He was not replacing his past, but making peace with it. He was honoring the love that had been while embracing the love that was. He closed the box and looked at Ruth, who was watching him from the porch. He walked over and took her hand, his scarred, calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Together, they stood and watched the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the mountains, their quiet life earned not by blood, but by choice, by